Introduce the person I think with the best job in Australia. He tells me that he's heard that before, and I'm not surprised because it sounds like a pretty good gig to me. I have, by the way, apologised to Jamie profusely for the fact that we misspelled his surname in the bulletin, but he seems to have forgiven us. Very briefly, because you've read the bulletin, Jamie has been with Penfolds now for 15 or 16 years and has had various roles, including Sommelier at Magill Estate, and then Brand Ambassador, but is now Global Brand Ambassador, which, as I say, I think is the best job in Australia for the best known wine brand in Australia. And without further ado, I'm going to ask him to address us on all things Penfolds.
Thank you so much, Chris. As you'll soon work out, I don't like to script my talks too much. I just like to fly off the cuff a little bit, and I'm more than happy to take questions. I know we've got a dedicated question time at the end, but if there's something that crops up whilst I'm rattling on, feel free to interject. Penfolds was founded in 1844 by South Australian historical standards. Of course, it's a long time ago. The city of Adelaide being founded by European migrants in 1836. So Dr. Penfold migrated here from England with his wife Mary and daughter Georgina just 8 years after the settlement of Adelaide, and purchased 500 acres of prime land at Magill, just 8 kilometres away from the city here, where he founded his surgery in what was known as the Grange Cottage, named after Mary Penfold's ancestral home in England. And of course, being a doctor, he realised that wine enjoyed many medicinal qualities, so he brought with him vine cuttings on his journey to Australia. The first thing he did was establish a vineyard outside the Grange Cottage. He was using the grapes to make medicinal tonics of various styles to administer to his patients. Of course, that's the only reason we drink wine today, because it makes us feel better. Before long, of course, people were knocking on the door of the surgery, not because they were ill, but they rather liked their newly prescribed medication, and they had a thriving wine business in no time. I guess what's not widely acknowledged is Mary Penfold's role in the whole enterprise. Whilst her husband was looking after his medical practice, she was the one tending the vines and making the wine. And indeed, she outlived her husband by 25 years. Dr. Penfold passing away in 1870, she soldiered on to 1895. And those intervening years were crucial to the development of Penfolds, and a lot of the beautiful old buildings that are still there, heritage listed on the estate today, were constructed during the reign of Mary. And the business enjoyed a period of great prosperity, and she introduced a lot of rigour into winemaking and making sure that the wines were made to very high standard across the board. And of course, that then led to further expansion under the guidance of Thomas Francis Highland, the son-in-law, and daughter Georgina, and then further family members down the pathway. I guess the prosperity of Penfolds hinged on fortified wine production in the early days, and it was for a couple of reasons. One, that was quite pragmatic. Fortified wines were easier to make, they were better understood, they were enjoyed by the Australian palate at the time that liked something a touch sweeter, and fortified wines were biologically stable. You didn't have these issues with bacterial spoilage that could blight in that era table wines. Table wines were more problematic. And the problems that faced table wine producers weren't really well understood until the 1940s and 50s, when together Max Schubert, the man who created Grange, and Arthur Ray Beckwith, who was a very gifted enologist and scientist that trained at Roseworthy and worked for Penfolds, sort of broke the code, if you like, to making wines stable. They realised the pH played a crucial role in wine stability, and Ray Beckwith convinced Frank Penfold Highland back in the 1940s to let him go and buy a Cambridge pH meter, which at the time cost half of his annual salary, that could measure the pH of fermenting wine and wine in tanks and barrels to determine whether or not he thought it fell within the acceptable range to make stable wines. It was this sort of major scientific discovery, and it was literally a Shazam moment on the bus on the way home from work one day that led Penfolds into a new era, a modern era, if you like, of table wine production, set the framework upon which they could build reliable, dependable and stable, crucially, wines. I guess the real seismic change that everyone recognises in the Australian wine industry was the creation of Grange back in 1951. That set the framework, if you like, for the new era. And Max Schubert, the creator of Grange, was inspired after having spent some time in Europe. He actually served in the AIF during the Second World War, but was sent on a fact-finding mission by the family in the 1950s to go and see what he could learn about wine production in Europe, particularly with fortified wines in Spain and Portugal. Fortunately for us, Max always had an eye on table wines, and he went to Bordeaux and he met some negociants, and he travelled around and tasted some wonderful old clarets out of cellars, 20, 30, 40 years old, and returned to Australia inspired to create a new wine here which would rival those wines of the old world for longevity and body and etc. And of course, he realised that he'd have to do things differently. But he also realised that he had a tremendous resource at his disposal here, because most of the vines in Europe had or were in the process of being blighted by phylloxera. We've never had an outbreak of phylloxera in South Australia, one of the few places in the world that hasn't. And as a result of that, we've got some of the world's oldest vineyards here. Penfolds lays claim to the world's oldest Cabernet Sauvignon vineyard in the Barossa Valley, Block 42, part of our Kaluna vineyard. That was planted by the Fowler family in 1888. There is no other older Cabernet vines in the world that we're aware of. Of course, there's even older Shiraz vines scattered throughout the Barossa, and there's some very old vines in McLarendale as well. So Schubert knew that he could rely on, particularly on the Shiraz vines, or the Cabernet played on his mind for a time too, to make this new table wine that became Grange. A few other things that he did differently as well, and that was rather than obsessively making a wine from a single vineyard, to employ a strategy of selecting the fruit on its merits to make a very consistent wine style. And that being the case, he didn't much mind where the fruit came from, as long as it was the best fruit that was delivered in any given vintage. And that philosophy still underpins many of the wines in the Penfolds range today, including Grange, St Henri, Bin 389, the Bin 28 and the 407 that we're enjoying today. The fruit is always graded in the field on its merits. Once it gets to the winery, it begins its fermentation process. It's tasted daily by the winemakers to see how it's progressing, and whether it's going up or down or sideways, what they can do with it. They make dynamic decisions in the winery, trying to steer those parcels of fruit in the right direction. And of course, the eyes are always on those top A grade. Are they good enough to make the cut for Grange or not? But every single fermenter in the winery, there's 196 of them in the Barossa now, are tasted by the winemaking team daily. So that takes a couple of hours to go through all of those fermenters to try and, they do spin, to try and make sure that they're steering each parcel in the right direction, making dynamic decisions, because many of our wines, including Grange, including 407, many of our wines will complete the fermentation process in the oak barrels, upon which they will then complete their 18 months or a year worth of maturation. So once you've made the decision about what kind of barrels you're putting the wine into, you're really narrowing the field of possibilities down. But there's one final and crucial stage in this process, which is called classification. That's what happens in May. So after vintage, we'll be wrapping up our vintage in a couple of weeks' time. Give the winemakers a couple of weeks off to reunite with their families, and then we bring them back and we make them taste everything that they made during vintage. We start at the top of the totem pole. We start all of those parcels in contention for Grange, line them up on a table, and they're done as a blind tasting. So it's all very serious, white lab coats in a sterile room, just judging what's presented to you in the glass in front of you on its merits. By doing this, you can kind of remove some of the emotion and prejudice that might otherwise exist if you know where the wine's been sourced from. So if it's your friend's vineyard down the road who's a contracted grower, or if it's one vineyard that you're responsible for looking after, you've got to kind of put all that to one side. You just have to judge what's in the glass on the occasion. The question with Grange, of course, is it good enough? Is it good enough to make the cut? And there's lots of umming and ahhing and debate around the table. Everyone gets to have their 2 bops worth. It's a semi-democratic process. Because Peter Gager, of course, has the ultimate say as the chief winemaker for Penfolds. But he consults widely. And this is part and parcel of the changing of the baton. There's only been 4 chief winemakers since Grange was created in 1951. There's always a generational change and development. So all the younger winemakers are learning their craft at these classification tables, to learn, make sure that when they are eventually making these crucial decisions, that they have a very profound understanding of the process and the checks and balances that go into it. So once they decide that this is what we're going to do, of course they don't know the exact amount that they've got of each of these parcels. One bottle that they tasted might be representative of 5 barrels and the next could be representative of 15 barrels. So they have to do a trial blend based on those. And if Peter and Steve Leonard, our senior red winemaker, are satisfied that that's the way to go, at that point in time, the wine is blended, the barrels are washed, and the wine is then returned to those barrels. The first racking of the wine out of the barrel, which is a really important process, and it might be racked another 3 or 4 times before eventually being bottled some 18 months down the track. So there's constant checks and balances, and this is the way that Penfolds is able to maintain a very high standard in terms of quality and consistency across our wines from vintage to vintage. You as a consumer don't have to go into the shop and get your smartphone out, look at James Halliday's app to tell you whether or not it was a great vintage for Penfolds, because our winemakers won't make the wine if they don't have the fruit. It all starts with that resource in the vineyard, the raw materials, the grapes. You can't take bad fruit and somehow engineer bad fruit into good wine. It all has to start with good fruit in the vineyard. So we have a challenging vintage. You'll tend to find that the wines are still of a high standard. We just make less of it. And when we're spoiled for choice, when we have really good vintages, rather than, trying to make 3 times the volume of Grange or 389 as we would in an average year, they'll make the same amount, but they'll just try to set the bar that little bit higher. And that happens with Grange. In fact, the 2010 Grange that we released in October last year will go down in history as one of the all-time greatest Granges ever made, without any question. It's a beautiful wine. Many commentators have already given it perfect 100-point scores for people that are interested in scores, but we know that we're on pretty solid footing with that particular wine. It should last for 60-odd years in the bottle. But they didn't make 3 times the volume that they did in 2009. They made the same amount, but they took the opportunity to make the wine even better. And of course, Grange being such an important wine to Penfolds, it casts its halo when it gets those 100-point scores on all of the other wines in the range, and that of course then drives demand. So it's quite a sensible business theory, if you like. I liken the Penfolds portfolio to a pyramid structure. And at the very top, you've got the most expensive, rarest and best wines that we can produce. Grange, 707, St. Henri, Magill Estate Shiraz, RWT Shiraz. These are the very lofty top point of the Penfolds range. And then the next level down is the bin wines, which we're enjoying today. And these wines, of course, are the beneficiaries of this rigorous process. The parcels that narrowly miss out on becoming Grange, they're used to make the bin 389. Declassified Grange can't go into any of those other top tier Shirazes because the oak maturation is different. Next point of call, 389. Same thing with bin 707. Sometimes we declassify all of the 707. All of that fruit ends up going into 389 or bin 407. So there's a sort of natural pecking order that occurs throughout the entire Penfolds portfolio, which I think holds us in pretty good stead. So that's a little bit on the winemaking philosophy, perhaps more than I was originally going to say. But what I would perhaps touch on now is just a bit of what we've been up to. A few minutes I think I have remaining. We've enjoyed a pretty interesting journey over the last couple of years. Of course, last year was our 170th birthday. It was a very big milestone for the brand. And we celebrated in a couple of different ways. One, we changed the release dates for our wine. That was big news. Ordinarily, we release our bin wines in March, and our, what we call the icon and luxury or the premium range of wines, including Grange in May. You couldn't think of a worse time of the year to launch your wines from a winemaker's perspective. Of course, winemakers are very important to our sales and marketing endeavours as well as the winemaking endeavour, because we want them out on the road talking to customers, talking to consumers, hosting events, hosting dinners, hosting tastings, and try doing that in March when you're in the middle of vintage. It's a tough ask, very hard to get them out on the roads. The last few years we've got away with it by doing virtual tastings, holding the tasting at Magill and filming it and beaming Peter Gago around the world, which is fun, but the novelty wore off. And we decided that it was time to actually make the shift to an October release, and that makes sense for a number of reasons. And of course, one of them is that you're selling into a much better time of the year as well, into the very profitable Christmas, New Year, Chinese New Year, Thanksgiving, such season. In fact, in America, 2/3 of all wine sales are made in October and November for the whole country. So it's a very positive change for us. The other big thing that we're doing at the moment is renovating the Magill Estate cellar door, or in fact we're putting together a whole new cellar door. For those of you that have visited the Magill cellar door, you'll know that you'll struggle to swing a cat. If we get 15 people in there, it feels a touch crowded. Whereas the Barossa Valley cellar door that we have is quite large. So that's always been a bit of a miss. I've been working at that Magill winery for over 15 years. Been looking forward to the day where the company would commit the money to building a brand new cellar door. And they're doing it with some gusto, I have to say. For those of you that are familiar with the winery, when you come in the main entrance off Penfolds Road, you drive up the top of the driveway, the beautiful Magill Estate Restaurant, which has recently been renovated and reopened, is on the right. The buildings on the left-hand side, which used to house our reception area and office space, that's all been gutted. It's a beautiful old heritage building. It's been stripped back to its bare bones. Everything's been renovated. We've had lots of cracking issues. We've had termite problems, you name it. We've had issues with the old buildings, but they've spruced them all up beautifully, and they're putting the final touches on the interior fit-outs now. They've also built a new structure at the front, quite a modern structure, which stands aside from the rest of it. And that's going to be a cafe, so we call it the Magill Estate Kitchen, and that's going to seat around about 100 people. The cellar door will easily fit 100 people, plus we've got 3 dedicated new private tasting spaces that seat about a dozen people each, and an area that we're calling the gallery that will be able to do seated functions for about 50 odd people. Other than that, there's tunnels that you take as you journey underneath the winery into the bins where Max Schubert stored those earlier wines. They're all being spruced up as well, so we can host tastings in there and have lovely displays. I recently negotiated with the Schubert family, Max Schubert's family, to buy his personal collection of wines. So we'll have that on display, Max's personal Grange collection, and a collection of curio wines that he made in the 50s, 60s and 70s that are just incredible. And I learned a lot actually just even reading the handwritten notes on the labels of these wines. So with a little bit of luck, if we haven't got any more delays from the builders, they're telling us we'll get the keys at the end of April, and by the time we train our staff and bump in everything that we need and make sure that the tills work, we'll be open in the sort of mid to late May. I would have thought it's the best guess at this point. So I hope you can all come up and check it out. If you haven't had the opportunity to come out and have a look at the Magill Estate Restaurant as well, it's not an inexpensive experience, I'll grant you that, but for a special occasion, it's certainly worth going to splurge. We're very pleased to find that the restaurant, since it's open, it's been reopened now for getting close to 2 years. I think this coming September will be 2 years. That the restaurant has picked up a top 10 ranking in Gourmet Traveller, and also by John Lathine, who writes for The Australian, ranked it in his top 10 restaurants in Australia. That's not a bad effort for a restaurant that's only been trading for a little over 18 months now. The philosophy is very simple. It's about taking the very best produce that they can get and presenting it in the best possible way, married perfectly with Penfolds wines. So I do urge you to come up and have a look at that. Just one other thing I thought I might talk about, just touch on today, is the vintage 2015. People are always interested to know what's going on with the vintage. Things are still ticking away. They haven't started classifying the wines yet, but the signs are overwhelmingly good. It's turned into a fairly compressed vintage. As many of you will remember, we had quite a hot spell in the middle of February. It has been fairly mild up to that point, which we like. We actually like mild conditions in the run-up to vintage. And all of the signs were overwhelmingly positive in the lead up to vintage, but then we had that hot spell, which effectively meant that everything ripened very quickly. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as you can get it off in optimal condition. And a lot of our vineyards these days are harvested by very expensive harvesting machines. So once we were ready to get it off, they just basically harvested all of the Shiraz and the Barossa in a week. And I went up to the winery at the time, and they only recently completed a massive extension of the winery to take us up to 196 fermenter capacity. And I looked and I saw the old rotary fermenters, which hadn't been used in years, they were all turning. And I said to the winemaker, what on earth? You've got those old rotaries going for? I thought they were consigned to the dustbin of history, that we were going to be getting rid of them. She said, Literally, if you take your shoes off at the moment, someone will crush grapes and pop them in, right? We'll ferment in anything. Every grape in the Barossa basically has come in 1 week. So, wherever we can fit it, we'll fit it. We've even got A-grade Shiraz going in rotary fermenters instead of the statics that we'd normally use, and that's unusual. The quality signs, though, are looking really positive. From the ferments that I've looked at, they're looking really, really good. We've got a fair bit of Cabernet that's been coming in from the southeast as well. That's also shaping up to be pretty good indeed. So I know we've dedicated a few minutes to questions. I'm more than happy to take your questions. Chris, if there's people that have got any. Yes?
I noticed both these reds are under screw cap. Which of your better reds are under screw cap? Which one?
The vast majority of our wines these days are bottled under screw cap for the Australian market. There are a couple of exceptions. Peter Gago insists on using cork for Grange, and there's a couple of other wines. Magill Estate Shiraz is all under cork, and that's mostly because it doesn't make sense to split it. It's a very small production from a very small vineyard, and some of our cellar reserve wines are still bottled under cork. Peter is of the opinion that cork, if it's good cork, can do a really good job with fine wine. And that screw cap, the oldest screw cap wine that we've got for experimental purposes is back in 1996 with 389. That's when we started to tinker around with it. And so we don't really have older screw caps that we can say they're going to be great in 50 years' time. We think everything anecdotally points towards it, but we don't know. And we do know that fine wine collectors that are buying top Bordeaux and other great wines around the world have a leaning towards cork. So we'll stay with cork in our range for the time being until a better alternative comes along. Because after all, screw cap technology, although it's terrific, it's been around for a while, we think perhaps there's a technological leap forward that we're just waiting to happen.
Expanding on John's question, where are you getting your cork from, and how can you afford to compete with some of the European small wineries that want that absolutely top quality cork?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, most of the cork is produced in Spain and Portugal. We've got a number of suppliers that we get them from. I don't deal with that end of the business, but I do know that when it comes to Grange, that we're buying what we'll reference one quality corks, which are very high quality corks. Whether or not the Europeans are getting a better deal than us, it's hard to know. I mean, you do take some corks out of those beautiful first grade bottles and you look at them and you think, they are really very good corks. But all we can do is buy the best quality that's available to us. We batch test extensively, so we literally take representative samples from each parcel of corks that we get, soak them in water for a few days and get the winemakers to smell them. It's the most effective way to batch test, and then you put them through chemical analysis to measure the TCA tone. So you just do the best you can. But I guess the other point to make is that screw caps aren't infallible either. That a screw cap is prone to mechanical damage if you are not careful with it and you hit it. It can break the seal and they can leak if they're stored incorrectly. So the most important thing with wine, I think, is not necessarily the closure. It used to be. In the 90s, there was a lot of issues with cork taint. And I think the cork producers who lived in denial for years, in the face of competition from screw cap, had to get their act together. And now the process is vastly superior, especially if you're paying for those top quality corks that have gone through all sorts of reverse osmosis and that sort of stuff in order to clean out any impurities. So we're pretty happy with the quality that we get.
And the temperature
So
is also.
storage is crucial. So the closure is one thing, but really, if you're not storing your wine properly, you can't expect it to live for a long time. Many of the wines that we produce are destined for a long spell in the cellar. Therefore, make sure that you invest in a wine cabinet or store them correctly at the right temperature in the cellar. Good quality wine stored under the bed in Adelaide will not last very long without summers. And in winter, when we come home, we put our heaters on. It's that rapid change in temperature all the time that causes havoc for fine wine. So, in the laundry in the coolest spot in the house doesn't cut it if you want to keep a wine for 20 years. You need to invest in proper storage.
Jamie, just following from your answer on that question about damaged screw tops. In the old days, if we got a bottle of wine to the table and it wasn't quite right, we'd tell the waiter it was corked. And at the risk of offending some sensitive ears, I was told by a sommelier friend the other day that the correct expression now is tell the waiter that the wine is screwed. Is that correct?
Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, Penfolds has offered a recorking clinic service, which I'm sure some of you have attended over the years. We've been doing it now since 1991, where we invite people to bring in their old Penfold wines and have them recorked under clinical conditions. We open up the wine, we put some gats in there to protect it whilst we're tasting it and assessing it. We top it up with some current release wine, and then we put a brand new, fresh, springy cork in there to replace the old, worn-out, daggy one. But we won't have rescrewing clinics anytime soon. That's the point I was trying to make, I suppose. But what we do know is that the incidence of cork taint is thankfully dropping because of those improvements in production. And if anyone ever does find that they have a quality issue with any Penfold wine, there's a number on the back of all the bottles that you can call, which leads you to our consumer relations department that deal with these sorts of issues. And if you've got a corked range, that's fine. No point telling us that you drank it though. They're not going to replace it. But and that happens, believe me. You get these long-winded emails about we have this terrible, terrible grain. Oh, can you send it back to us and we'll replace it? Well, we drank it. We're not going to replace it. But if it's corked, and we'll send you a kit so you can put a proper stopper in it, put it in a styrofoam container and send it back to us, and we'll subject it to some analysis. But they will take most things at face value. If in good faith you've said you've got a problem with the wine and send it back to us, they'll replace it. So, they're pretty good with things like that. I mean, the reputational damage that comes from not looking after your customers if they think they've got a problem is not worth the gamble. And most people are pretty good with those sorts of things.
I might just say that I can vouch for that. I opened a bottle of Grange a couple of years ago now, which was corked, and I got in touch with Treasury Wines. They did exactly as Jamie said, sent me a styrene box to send it. I had to recork it with the same cork, sent it back, and obviously they don't just dish this out without testing. They tested it. They didn't send me, I must say, a replacement 1986 Grange, but I didn't expect them to. But they sent me back a current vintage, it was a current release Grange, plus a bottle of 707, and I gave them 11 out of 10.
That's really encouraging to hear. They do take that sort of thing seriously. And, as much as we'd love to replace like with like, it's not possible because we just don't have very many of those in our museum anymore. It's impossible to account for that. But I suppose the 86 Grange on release would have been, I think at the time, about $40. And the one they replaced it with is currently worth $785. Not a bad return on investment. Any other questions?
You indicated that you do rely on outside growers for some of your
Yes.
grapes for grain.
Yep.
I think Oliver Tarini.
Yeah. Oliver's training in that.
Provide. What percentage of the grapes you put in Grange come from your own vineyards and what come from outside buyers? How can you maintain control over such a prestige wine with an outside grower?
Well, the control one's very easy to answer because the outside grower's fruit is subjected to the same checks and balances as our own fruit. So it has to go through exactly the same process where it's graded in the field, it's graded during fermentation, it's subjected to the same rigours, in the same lineup as our company vineyard wines to become eligible to make the cut for grain. So from a quality control perspective, it's easy. We employ a team of what we call GLOs, grower liaison officers, who their job, they are specialist viticulturalists, and their job is to work with our growers to make sure that we're getting better quality fruit from them year to year. We want all the growers that are producing B-grade fruit that might make a bin wine to producing A-grade fruit that might make the cut for an RWT or an Henri or a Grange. And that's hard to do. So we'll give them the big company know-how, if you like, the satellite photos, the soil probes, all of that sort of stuff to give them the knowledge that they need and the tools that they will help them to get their fruit into a high quality wine. As for percentages, that will change from vintage to vintage, just depending on what makes that final classification cut. So, there's been some years when no growers have made the cut and it's been 100% company. There are other vintages where growers would contribute quite a lot. It does vary from year to year. Generally Grange is about 80 to 90% Barossa fruit, with contributions from Magill, McLaren Vale, sometimes Clare, and elsewhere.
Yes, John.
My students studied the wine industry a couple of semesters back, and they came across Penfolds marketing in China with exactly the same label. You don't have to worry about it.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, I guess it always has something to worry about with China. I mean, if you want to buy Penfolds bin 408, there's lots of that going around in China at the moment. Someone sent me a photo of that the other day. Counterfeit is definitely an issue in China. It's an issue in other markets as well. I guess all you can do with counterfeit is encourage consumers to make sure that they're buying through the correct channels. If you're getting it out of the boot of somebody's car and you're paying a quarter of the recommended retail price, you're probably not getting an authentic product. I remember listening to the guy who was in charge of selling Rolexes in Asia at a speech once in Singapore, and he said to me, he goes, because I said, you must have big problems with counterfeit. And he goes, yeah, we're probably the most counterfeited brand in the world. And he goes, but when you buy a fake Rolex from a guy flashing them out of his jacket, right, and you put it on your wrist and it feels tinny, right, that does not have the same level of satisfaction as buying an authentic Rolex, right? And I said, yes, I take your point. I said, the trouble is that a lot of people that buy fake wine don't know that it's fake. Right, so whereas with a fake Rolex, you've got a pretty good idea if you're buying it for $20 that it's not actually made from gold. So that's the uphill battle for us. All we can do is build the consumer education side of things, so the consumers know how to check whether they've got the authentic product, and work very carefully with our distributors and wholesalers and all the markets that we sell our wines in the world to combat it. We have a legal team of intellectual property people who, as soon as something like that crops up, they jump on it like a ton of bricks. But it'll be a never-ending battle with China. It's Medusa's head.
Unfortunately, I can tell that this discussion could go on for some time, but unfortunately we have run out of time. But Jamie,